We'll try this once again. Hello, Hockey World. Today is Thursday, September 27th, 2018.
I'm Peter Tessier in Winnipeg.
I'm Kevin Allen of USA Today Sports.
We have Russ Cohen, possibly from Pittsburgh, on location, and I'm Michael Agello, and this is the HockeyBuzzcast here on HockeyBuzz.com. Russ is, I believe, is some USHL invitation or event in Pittsburgh, and he's covering that. Let's get started here. Kevin, I was in the press box in Toronto on Monday, and Pierre LeBrun had tweeted out something that got a lot of play on Twitter regarding starting training camps earlier and the season starting a little early, starting mid-September instead of the first week of October, and then the Stanley Cup final ending by, say, Memorial Day, and everything being moved up. And Larry Brooks sort of echoed that today. He said training camp is simply too long, diminishing returns at this point. Vets are bored. Objective now is to avoid injury. Basically saying the camps are too long. And I know the coaches will bristle at this because the coaches want time to evaluate. But a team like Toronto plays 8 preseason games, and I think it's excessive. But what are your thoughts?
Well, for sure, I completely agree, and I think even coaches would admit that the days when you bring guys to camp and try to decide who makes the roster, they're gone. Like you've almost sort of figured out coming into camp who has a shot. Every once in a while, someone will surprise you, but the number is so few that I don't think that it overcomes the risk of injury that comes from preseason. And the days when players needed preseason to get in shape are gone. This is not the 1970s. Players are in shape all throughout the year. They stay in shape in the off season. And I think I thought Larry Brooks made an extra point when he said, the argument that the teams will make is that they need the preseason dates, the revenue, but it's not going to make or break a team. If they went down to 4, losing the additional revenue is not enough that's going to put them over the top between making money and losing money. So I think we could easily do that, and I think everyone would be happy. And by everyone, I think fans, players, general managers, arena officials who have to make sure they get enough concert dates in the summer. If the NHL final was wrapped up, by early June at the latest, and maybe Memorial Day, so it makes way too much sense for them to not start in September and push into not push into the middle of June.
Yeah, if you start this, if the season's rolling by September 15th and you have it wrapped up by June 1st, you've given all the last 4 teams a little more time to prepare for a very busy period of the season, which is RFA time, UFA, and the draft. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot that has to be done. And more we're seeing these are the kinds of things where a lot of activity happens in the NHL. And giving GMs the time to do it seems to make more sense. The other aspect is we know players are coming, as Kevin, you just said, fit and everything. This is about just getting them on the ice, getting them aligned with what's going on. And, those are your stars. And unless your roster's turning over significantly, you know what you've got coming in, where your prospect pool is. Mm-hmm. And there's no reason to extend it out. I think the one argument that you would always hear pushback from is revenue. And I think there's probably got to be ways that the NHL, with its other revenue streams, can somehow trickle down more money back to teams and all, in certain ways that aren't a part of the revenue of the player split. But again, we have a potential, CBA revamp coming in 2 years. So who knows what'll happen. But if I were the players, I'd want to put this on the table. Reduce the time. Less wear and tear on the body, less chance for injuries. And we now are getting those.
Yeah, I mentioned this on a previous show after Monday because Mike Babcock was asked about this in the press conference, and really he had no way of answering it. It's like the problem is that in front of the home fans at Scotiabank Arena, and they only had 3 home preseason games. And obviously the fans want to see either Matthews or Tavares, and he had a split group where one was in one group and one was in the other. This was the game after the first half of the preseason where he decided to put all the NHL likelies in one group and most of the AHL likelies in another. And in a home game against Montreal, it was essentially the Toronto Marlies and their fourth line. And that was basically it. And fans were emailing and texting and tweeting reporters saying, I paid good money for this and this is crap. And I understand that point of view, especially when it's somebody, who may not be a season ticket holder and they get this ticket and they hope to see somebody. But that's the reality here. You have 8 preseason games and you're not going to beat up your number one players. You're the guys who have to get through 82 games. You're not going to play them 20 minutes a night and play them in every game. So it's a delicate balancing act. And I think that's sort of solved by lessening the games. 8 games is too many. Yeah,
no. And I can imagine what Mike Babcock said to that, because he would always say in the thing, I'm preparing my team to compete, I'm not.
That's exactly what he said, Kevin. That's exactly
what he said. Okay. Yeah. But that's what normally he would say. I'm preparing my team, and I really don't give much thought to anything other than that. So.
Yeah, and I think, and basically what he said was, I usually touch base with the opposing coach because the Leafs play 4 back-to-backs. They play Ottawa, Buffalo, Detroit, Montreal back-to-back, and usually he touches base with the coach and says, okay, what lineup do you plan on playing? Because, I'll have a correspondingly balanced lineup. And I don't want to put an AHL lineup against your full team. Mm-hmm. On Friday and Saturday, they played back-to-back against Detroit. And apparently I'm assuming he contacted Jeff Blashill, who was one of his assistants in Detroit, and said, okay, we have to play our A lineup because of what happened on Monday. And so Detroit is probably doing the same. And so the game on Saturday is probably going to be Marlies versus Grand Rapids, basically.
Yeah.
And why should you have to pay a full ticket price for that too, right? That's the other thing from the fan experience. It gets a little, season ticket packages, you almost feel like, wow, I'm really not getting the value that I'm getting in 2 weeks. And frankly, if you reduce the games, you can plan this out too in terms of who your A's or B's. And the irony in this is that it's a lot like what we call in Canada, at least, Timbits and House League hockey, where you have 7-year-olds and stuff, and you say, okay, well, I've got let's put my 4 top kids on against your 4 top kids, so everyone can play against equal talent and stuff, and no one's feeling too hard, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, and there's really no lure for fans in the preseason. I mean, the old days where you wanted to see the young kids, but again, nowadays, your farm and your prospect list is clearly defined. Fans today know more about the ranking of your prospects than ever before. They know what's going to happen. And, I've heard some fans say, well, yeah, but what about the junior kid that's trying to earn a spot on the roster? Well, you can still keep him for 10 games and see what he can do. So I just don't see any reason to continue this charade of having preseason games they're really valuable to helping you decide who's going to be on your team. In the middle of August what your roster is going to look like, except unless you acquire somebody on the eve of the season because your defense or your forward group isn't good enough.
Yeah, and I think I think it's very possible to determine a 4th line winger or a 6th defenseman or a backup goaltender through scrimmages and practices and four exhibition games rather than a lengthier time period. Now, one of the things that Larry Brooks did mention in his tweet was injuries and how a lot of teams are hoping, just keeping their fingers crossed that they avoid serious injuries. Well, there have been a few over the last 24 to 48 hours that I think are going to have some effect on their teams. The first one and the most damaging one was the Corey Perry injury. Apparently, it was in warm-ups, and he damaged meniscus and MCL on one of his knees, and it came out yesterday, Kevin, that he's out 20 weeks, which equals 5 months. And this is a player whose career, at least his statistics, have been in decline the last few years. He scored 19 goals 2 years ago, 17 last year. He's under contract for another 2 years after this year, $8.62 million. I'm starting to wonder whether we've seen the last of Corey Perry, because this is a serious injury.
Yeah, no, this really is, and it's, even at, you figure, okay, well, he'll be a little more than 17, and even if he's just a 20-goal scorer, but the Ducks, can't afford to give up a 20-goal scorer, not in the Pacific Division. So this is a tough loss for them. And, to me, the bigger injury was Seth Jones. Like, if you're the Columbus Blue Jackets, losing him for 4 to 6 weeks, and not having your number one defenseman, and he's really kind of become the foundation block of that team, in my opinion. Like, he was on my Norris Trophy ballot last year. I had him down a ways. I can't remember exactly, but I think third or fourth I had him, in the voting. But I thought he was deserving. I thought he was one of the best defensemen in the league. So, losing him, we all know the importance of a good start now. Teams that have poor starts, it's difficult for them to dig out. So now all of a sudden, a team that was probably already, on the bubble, not because they're a poor team, but because their division is so good. Now they got to start without, arguably their most important player, a guy that's going to play 27 minutes. So, that injury is big as well. And it just, again, speaks to, why do we have so many preseason games?
Now, Peter, you've had experience watching Perry in the West, and he once was a great player. Last couple of years, his numbers have declined, his speed has declined. This is still, as Kevin pointed out, this is a serious injury, in the sense that, they don't have a ton of goal scorers. Kessler his health is in question. We don't know when he's coming back. They've got Nick Ritchie holding out right now. He's as an unsigned RFA. So right now, Bob Murray, I think, is challenged right with the team as it currently is, because they have 2-3 players that are key for them that are not going to be in the lineup opening night.
Yeah, the Ducks, it's going to be difficult for them. I think Perry's an interesting case because his numbers have sort of been all over the place the last few years. And, in some ways you wonder, like, if he can make a full recovery from the injury. So assuming he comes back, treatment's fine, and there's no lingering things. What is he expected, 5 months out? That's what the word is.
Yeah. So it's basically
5 months out of the grind could also do wonders for the body in other ways too.
That's true.
And, and I always go back to what Teemu Selanne said about the longevity of his career. He said that one lockout year in the 04-05, he said, if I hadn't had that, I don't think I'd still have been playing, later on, because of what it allowed him to do. Perry plays hard minutes. And he plays hard. He's a physical and a lot of people would say dirty player, and that comes at a price too. Guys target him as much as he targets them.
Sure.
He's put a lot of wear and tear on that body. So short term, it's going to have a massive impact on the Ducks. They are not the team of depth that they used to be. I think they're probably very happy they still have Adam. They have Adam Henrique in the lineup, because imagine if they didn't. If they hadn't made that trade and kept him on. It's a big loss for them. And I think, if you're the Sharks or the Kings or any, or particularly even like a team like Edmonton or Calgary, you're loving this, because this is the kind of thing that upsets the apple cart just enough that maybe you can, you're going to make some hay when the sun shines, when you don't have Corey Perry around for 5 months.
And Kevin, I saw the scientific predictions that you made at USA Today, and I think you had Anaheim in fourth in that division, just ahead of Calgary and Edmonton. That was maybe a point or two. A loss of Perry, that could be a point or two at least.
No, I agree, and I had said because that came out after I had finished all that, and someone had asked me whether that would have adjusted, and I would have adjusted that. I would have put them down. And to be honest. One of the things I asked myself before I did that, as you called, scientific study of my point projections, I said to myself, I wondered whether I was giving the Ducks too much respect, because the Ducks have been there now. They've hung on. They've been competitive for a while. They're there. We see them as a good team. They've had Getzlaf. We like their defensemen, Lindholm and Fowler. There's a good group of defensemen there. Manson has really come on. They've got a lot of good people. But I wondered, am I just not catching that they're just a little bit on the decline? And then when I saw the Perry injury, it just made me say, if I'm that concerned about the loss of one player, that tells me that maybe I was giving them too much respect.
Well, unlike other years where I think they could absorb, Getzlaf scoring one goal before Christmas or an injury to John Gibson for a month or two, I think the buffer zone is gone now. I think, now that they've lost, they don't know when they're getting Kessler back. They know Perry's going to be gone most of the regular season, if, maybe the entire, depending on how he reacts. They don't have as much leeway here. Everybody's got to stay healthy and everybody's got to perform at a certain level. Otherwise, they're going to be on the outside looking in. Yeah,
no, that's really fair. And, I did during the NHL media tour, one of the players that was on that obviously was Connor McDavid. And he just said he felt like the Pacific Division was so underrated because, top to bottom, like even a team like Arizona, if you look at what they did the last 2 months of the season, they were among the top teams in the league. And after Ranta got healthy, and he even said, McDavid said, it's hard to go into Arizona and win. They've got some talented players and Ranta's good and everything. And, Vancouver now has a collection of younger players. Everyone's talking about Elias Pettersson, and they got Brock Besser and, Horvat, and there's a lot of interesting players there. And that Pacific, with Edmonton expected to be improved, and I think we do expect that they'll be a better team. We definitely think Calgary will be a better team as well. So that Pacific is going to be, really strong as well. So, these injuries are really significant, and it just goes right back to what we said before about there's hardly any good reason to have a longer preseason, and a lot of reasons not to have a lengthy preseason.
One of the interesting things to that point, Kevin, is the recovery time you have as a team if you start off slow. Because if you dig yourself in a hole, and I've seen people who have done studies of this, that guys who are outside the top 8 in their conference now, by the end of October, it's a ridiculously small percentage that ever get back into it by the end of the season. So, you lose a Perry and Seth Jones too, right? The other players, he's sick, out 4 to 6. If he goes 6 weeks, that's a massive loss for Columbus, and you might never be able to recover, depending on what other teams do.
Yeah, and the other injury that I was going to mention, and Kevin, you mentioned Arizona, was Alex Galchenyuk out week to week with a lower body injury. That's not the start that I'm sure he wanted in Arizona after all the years in Montreal. And that's a young team. And I think they need that scoring to, if they aspire to, at least challenge for a playoff spot. I think they need Ranta, as you said, playing like he played the last couple months, and they need Galchenyuk along with Clayton Keller and a few other players to score. And I'm not sure how long he's going to be out. They say week to week, but that's a loss that could hurt the Coyotes to get a good start this year.
Couldn't agree more. In fact, I think the Coyotes believe, and this is a really strong statement, but I think the Coyotes believe, had Ranta not been injured at the start of the season, that they would have made the playoffs. Like they were that confident in their ability that they would at least been knocking on the door. That if they look at the way they played in the final 2 months of the season, I think I wrote this, and I think he was 14-4 in his last 18 starts, as I recall.
Something like that. And he was like his first 7 or 8 starts, I think he was like 1-7 or something like that. It was just, they were not playing well. I mean, they remember what was it? It was almost Halloween before they had their first victory.
That's right. But Ranta was just all banged up, and even when he came back, he wasn't really ready to play. So, had he not been injured, who knows? And, there's a lot to like about that team. With Chikrin as being a younger player who I think, is his best hockey still in front of him. And as you mentioned, Clayton Keller, and I like that trade, the Galchenyuk trade. And I think they were really counting on him, as you said, to be the guy that scored the goals for him. And, not having him there at the start of the season is pretty discouraging.
Now, some some demotions over the last couple days. I'm not going to go through all of them, obviously, but I'm just talking about some of the young players. Boquist, the first round pick of the Blackhawks, got sent down. So did Tolvanen, the highly regarded first pick from last year that the Nashville Predators signed after he completed his time in the KHL. He got sent down to Milwaukee. Kevin, I watched Jesperi Kotkaniemi yesterday play against the Maple Leafs, third pick overall this year. A lot of people thought he was a bit of a reach, playing really well, and he played up against Tavares and Matthews and Kadri at times during that game and didn't look out of place. I think Montreal is going to keep him, and I think they're going to at least give him the 9 games, but I think they may give him more than that. He looked pretty good.
Well, they should keep him. I mean, you're at this. If you're the Canadians, what you have to sell is hope, and the hope is in a player like him. And they have trouble scoring, and he's a skilled player, and there's no reason not to give him the opportunity to play. And I'm a big believer in that. Like, the idea that you got to send these guys back down and give them more time. I think that's a little outdated. And when I say that, I mean just as a matter of course. You just send them down because they're young. Yeah. I think, it's a judgment call. And, from everything I've read, and I've not seen him play this year in the preseason, but from everything I've read, he's played well enough to have earned the opportunity to be up. Yeah. So it makes perfect sense to me. It's a younger man's league now. We have taken steps through the years to assure that younger players can utilize their skills and their physical deficiencies have been altered through the years by all the training that they now do in the off season. So they come to the league a little stronger than an 18-year-old player used to come to the league. And when you factor all those together, where the need for speed and skating and so forth, there's just no reason not to bring a very talented youngster into your lineup.
A couple of days ago, I said on the Buzzcast that, Montreal, given what Montreal is likely to be as a team, they should probably give him the 9 games, see how he goes, then throw him back down, let him do World Juniors, let him do that stuff, and just not take the abuse and some of the scrutiny that's going to come in Montreal is what could be a very rough season for the franchise, and have him not sort of have that weight on him, and also not burn an entry-level year.
Right.
But given what Claude Julien was saying after the game last night and what he said a bit, I agree with you, Kevin. I think they're probably going to keep him. Yeah. And and I compared it before to what the Jets did with Mark Scheifele, and they knew he could play in the preseason. He was scoring goals. He was having, he was looking great. But when the games got a little tighter, once the regular season started, it became a little more difficult for him. And then they sent him down. And I was thinking, well, that's probably what Montreal might do. But I think he's moved the goalposts for them, and rightfully so. He's looked really good.
Well, it's time for me to get on my annual soapbox about the treating of younger players. And I make this speech every year, and I've made it since Steven Stamkos was a rookie when the Tampa Bay Lightning, I believe it was Rick Tocchet.
No, it was Barry Melrose. It was Barry Melrose.
No, it was Rick Tocchet, I think. Did Tocchet follow?
Melrose was fired because he was putting Stamkos on the 4th line. And
No, that's not the point I'm going to make.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I believe it was Tocchet that followed.
You're correct.
Melrose. We'd have to look that up, but I think that's it. All kind of merges together. Yeah. But anyway, because Stamkos was struggling a little bit and trying to learn the game, what they decided to do, and when you look at the way society works, it makes perfect sense. When you bring a young lawyer in, you don't throw him out and say, okay, go argue your first case in a big litigation that's important to the firm. No, he's the second chair with a seasoned lawyer, and they sort of figure it out. And then after a couple of years, well, that's not the way we do it. We just throw them out, and you got to compete against the top players all the time. So why don't you develop a program to sort of ease them in? And what they did with Stamkos, if you recall, is once the Melrose was gone, he played like 8 or 9 games, and then he would take a game off, spend a couple of days in the weight room. He was asked to watch the game from above, and then he and assistant coach would sit down and talk about what he learned from watching. And by the end of the year, I talked to Stamkos about it, and he said he had learned so much. He was much stronger having those 2 days in the weight room that you get in the regular season. And it was like the proper way to do it. And by the end of the season, he was a far more complete, ready-to-go player than had he been if he'd have just been thrown in and played every game, not had a couple of days off and everything else. So that's the way I would do that. I'd bring in the younger guys, but, they'd be on sort of a program where, you'd play 8 games, take a game off, spend some time in the weight room, kind of talk about what you're learning, see a game from above, and just sort of ease them in a little bit instead of just kind of throwing them into the wolves. And if they're good enough, so be it. And if they're not, there should be more. These are very valuable assets, and I think people should take more care in making sure they kind of assimilate easier.
And you're correct. It was Rick Tocchet right after Melrose. Melrose was fired after 16 games, and Tocchet was the coach for the next 148 games.
Yeah, I thought it was Tocchet, but that was his plan. Like Stamkos didn't play every game. He played, right. I think it was would play 9 and get a game off, or maybe it was 8 and get a game off. I can't remember exactly, but that was the plan. And the days off were for him to get in the weight room and also to watch a game and learn. And I think that's the way you deal with all these younger players. So you want them out there and you want them learning and being part of it, but you also need to, sort of be mindful that they shouldn't be treated exactly like a veteran player.
Yeah, and right now, Dahlin is going to make the Sabres. Svechnikov is going to make Carolina. Kotkaniemi more than likely is going to make Montreal. Brady Tkachuk is more than likely going to make the Senators, and Zadina is going to make the Red Wings. So right now, last year I think it was only Hischier and Nolan Patrick that made it out of the first round, that played almost a full year. So that's it's completely subjective. It's based on the readiness of the players who are drafted. So it'll be exciting to watch, because I always like to see how young players handle the NHL right out of the gate. And Austin Matthews.
Didn't I see McClellan say that Bouchard had played well enough to?
Yes. Yeah, and I've also heard some stuff coming out of New Jersey about Ty Smith, their first round pick. And he was, I think, 16 or 17 that he could potentially make their roster. So it's more than that. I think it's about 8 or 9 right now that have not been sent down or sent back to junior. So, okay, let's get into the 2 previews here. The first one is the Ottawa Senators, and we could do an entire show about this one. But it was funny, Kev. I was reading your piece on the 10 players or owners or general managers who sort of could have underlying importance, and Eugene Melnyk was one of the 10. And the situation, just to start with this, the situation with Zach Smith, the waiving of Zach Smith, just another in a long line of bizarre things, because he wasn't waived because of anything he specifically did. They were doing it, according to Pierre Dorian, to send a message to the other players, and they pretty much knew that he wasn't going to be claimed because they had tried to trade him and teams had sort of balked at the $3.25 million contract. So it was sending a message, but you put a guy on waivers just to send a message. That's bizarre.
Well, it worked. They sent a message, but the message that Matt Duchene got, I saw him quoted as being a little upset by the waiving of that. Now, this is the same Matt Duchene that you're trying to convince to stay.
Yes.
Now, so Matt Duchene seemed pretty irked by the fact that his man was waived, and I don't think that was a very good message to Stone or Duchene as you're trying to recruit them to stay with the team. And again, I think it was the right choice of words. It's bizarre. He's very popular. It seemed to me you would know that he was popular with his teammates. I don't know. I just don't. I put Melnyk in there because, as I said in my piece, I think he owes it to the fans to do something to put a new face on this franchise. And, maybe the way to do it is to bring in a director of hockey operations. If you're sold on Pierre Dorian, then just bring in a guy over him, a Shanahan type. I don't know who that is. Maybe it's
Daniel Alfredson, but I don't.
Daniel Alfredson was the name that I thought, but maybe it's Ron Francis. There are people out there, obviously, that have a pedigree. but you need to put a different face on this franchise because Melnyk, I've covered the league a long time. I was trying to think of an owner who has alienated his fan base quite like Melnyk, and I struggled. I don't have one that's really done so much.
I can think of
I have one, but it
Okay,
goes back a
first,
long
Peter.
time ago.
You go.
Harold Ballard.
Now you stole mine, but Peter Pocklington possibly too.
Oh yeah.
Pocklington is that's a fair one too. I sort of discounted him because he had won championships, and so he had sort of earned some sort of historical significance for the franchise. And obviously Melnyk hasn't won anything in Ottawa, so I didn't include him. But I think it's fair to use that as a
and Harold Ballard systematically tore apart a great Maple Leaf organization for monetary purposes. I mean, if you ever read a book, read the book 67 by Damian Cox and Gord Stellick. He basically him and Stafford Smythe sold off minor league teams that the Leafs owned, whereas the Montreal Canadiens didn't do that in the late 60s, and that was why the Canadiens won Stanley Cups in the 70s and the Leafs did absolutely nothing. Getting back to the Senators, now they were 28, 43, and 11 for 67 points last year, and I will go out on a limb, Kevin, to say that they're not going to get close to that. But they do have talent. They do still have some talent, but they've traded off Hoffman. They've traded away Erik Karlsson. There are still players there that can score. There's still some quality players, but I don't know. The feeling I get is that it's it's a clown car right now that's sort of going to overwhelm these players. Sometimes when you have such situations like that going on, the rink is sort of your salvation and you just go in and play and hopefully win. I think that this is going to sort of overwhelm this team, and what's going on with Stone and Duchesne being UFAs and Craig Anderson supposedly wanting to get out of there, but then recanting that. All this is just going to continue to roll throughout the season. I don't know if they'll beat Colorado's bad record, but not by much.
Yeah, no, I had them at 52 points. I feel sorry for the younger players, the Colin Whites, the Brady Kachuks, Shabbat. Those are really quality young players, so it's not like the cupboard is bare. But boy, there's going to be a lot of negativity, even with the arena there, where that arena just seemed stale when it was new, and they've needed arena. It's too far out, obviously, from the downtown area, and just all of that. It's just one big umbrella of negativity that they need to somehow find some hope. And what you said was accurate. It's not like they're completely void of any skilled players. I mean, obviously Stone can play, and the younger players that I talked to, and Duchesne, he had some ups and downs with Ottawa, but mostly I think they were pretty happy with that deal. But they got to keep them. So
and the problem for Pierre Dorion is there is no GM in this league who's going to who's going to throw him a life ring to help him out of this. Like, he's in a really bad spin right now, and he's got problems. These other guys are going to try and feast on him, and this is a bad spin. And you said, Kevin, 52 points.
Yeah,
that's a 15-point drop from their last season,
and you might be even.
Yeah, and you might be generous. Like, that's that's and good on you. I mean, it's bad, and to the point of getting a new face. I think the problem that the Senators have is there's this very, I'll use the term questionable. There's not a lot of fact, but there's certainly a lot of suggestion that behind the scenes there are some financial problems within the organization of what is affordable to them, and paying a guy $500,000 to come in, and because it's going to start at 500,000 and it's only going to go up, and it's going to be way more for someone good to come in and take over that director of hockey operations role. That's not in Melnyk's budget. It's not in his wheelhouse. Well, and that's the biggest problem. Dorion's not the guy to be out there talking. But to pay someone to come in who's credible and do something, that's not in there. That might not even be available to them.
Well, to that point, Peter, the whole, the thing with Zach Smith that came out yesterday was, they had offers for Zach Smith. They wanted draft picks back. They didn't want to take a contract back. So, I mean, if that's the case, I mean, so you're penny pinching a guy who scored 5 goals last year, who's probably at his lowest possible value. And you're making conditions on the deal where, okay, you can't take a haircut on the contract. You can't take a contract back. I mean, if you're operating that way, I mean, how can you run a franchise that way? So it's puzzling. I mean, the thing is, they've made it clear that they're rebuilding, and how can you really go through a rebuild when you don't have your first round pick? The whole point of the rebuild, if you're tearing down that roster, is to add a young player with that number 1 pick, and that pick is in Colorado's coffers right now. So they can't really start the rebuild until probably 2019, 2020, when they do have their first round pick.
It's, you know what? And here's the thing, as a guy who covers a Central Division team and sees the Central Division, there's seven GMs in the Central Division who should all be giving Ottawa someone to help them. Like, there's 7 GMs who should be actually throwing Dorian a life ring, so Colorado doesn't get Jack Hughes. Like, I mean, they're the guys who should, they should all get on the phone and say, what can we give them so Colorado doesn't get Hughes? I mean, it's crazy.
Well, I mean, that's not unprecedented history. Remember the Evander Kane deal with Buffalo and Winnipeg. They wanted Kane for one reason. He was hurt, and he couldn't hurt their chances of getting the best odds on Connor McDavid. And by the way, when the Leafs traded their first round pick for Tom Curvers back in the early 90s, Quebec traded them 3 of their decent players so they could finish in last, and Toronto could finish ahead of them because Toronto didn't have their own first. Yeah. They ended up giving up Scott Niedermayer anyway, so what the hell? Okay, the other team is the Philadelphia Flyers. Now, they made the playoffs last year, 42, 26, and 14, 98 points. They added a big fish in free agency in James Van Riemsdyk, who comes back to the organization. I think this team has a good and growing young defense with Provorov and Gostisbehere. I know that Gostisbehere was hurt earlier in the preseason. I don't think it's a serious injury. They appear to have enough offense with Giroux and Voracek. The question, Kevin, is always been and probably always will be for the rest of our lives is their goaltending. And Alex Lyon is hurt, and he played great at the end of the year for them as a backup and in the Calder Cup playoffs. And Michael Neuwirth is hurt again. So it's back to like Anthony Stolarz and Brian Elliott, who has never been a steadying force. So, I mean, I think they could be undone by their goaltending until Carter Hart gets there, which is probably next year. But, that's just the par for the course with the Flyers.
Yeah. I'm bullish on this team. I'm respectful of the goaltending issues there, but I love their, the Provorov-led defense and Gostisbehere, and I like their offense. And I thought the Van Riemsdyk signing was one of the best offseason moves. Just adding some goal scoring. I just think there's a lot to like about this team, and I got to believe one of those goalies, will step up. Like the tandem worked last year, and I kind of think that's what Hextall kind of knows goaltending, and I think he's sort of figured out that maybe one of those guys, if they make the right choices, will be able to get them through. It's not an ideal situation. You'd rather have one guy, but I think they feel like their team is kind of strong enough, and because they went through this last year, that they'll be able to do that. So I think they're going to be finished ahead of the Penguins this year. I think they're going to be the second best team in that division.
Yeah, I mean, Elliott played on one leg while he was able to in the playoffs against the Penguins, and I think they brought in was Neuwirth later on in that series. But I mean, Peter, it's sort of this sort of hodgepodge. They're hoping one goaltender stays healthy and can carry them for 15 or 20 games. But I don't know. It just seems always that there's chaos in the net.
Yeah, and there is, and I think from anyone who covers Philly a lot, they know Ron's in a holding pattern because he's waiting for one of these prospects to come through,
right,
and be the guy. And so I understand that he can be a little bit patient. You can't be patient forever. But the interesting thing is the Flyers in just total goals against last year were 16th in the league. They were right in the middle of the pack, and they were about 14th, I think, for goals for. So
right.
they're in the middle of the pack and things, and they made the playoffs. So knowing what they have as assets and goal coming up the pipe, you're betting that you're going to get one of those guys coming in. So what's the next best thing to do? Well, we can score more. So they get Van Riemsdyk. They may score their way out of some problems here. It may not be pretty, but that was probably a better solution than trying to go find something else the other way. And one that you can get out of too if it doesn't work. And I think that was a smart move. So like Kevin, I think they're going to take a step. They could take a massive step if the goaltending shores up.
Yeah.
But I don't expect it to. But I think the Flyers are a team people should be bullish on.
Yeah, people kind of see Provorov as a rival as kind of the key that's kind of vaulted him. But you know what, to me, it is Couturier, becoming an offensive force. Like, it was almost like he was typecast. As soon as he showed up, he was so smart defensively that everybody just wanted to say, oh, well, he's just a really fine defensive forward. And then all of a sudden, he's become an offensive force as well. And that's just given them another, they already had Giroux, and now they've got him. And now they've added Van Riemsdyk. So Gostisbehere is a great, can distribute the puck and get it to the right guys. And Provorov's getting better. So they're on an improvement track that I think is going to sort of move them along. And Peter's absolutely right. Like, is it unthinkable that if they're goaltending, could they win that division? I think that's possible. I still think Washington. It sort of feels like they're playing with house money, and now that the pressure's off, like they could really be good. But I would put nothing past the Flyers. I like this team quite a bit.
Now, Couturier had a knee injury going into training camp. I think his work has been limited, but I haven't heard anything. I think he's going to start the regular season.
Yeah.
Carter Hart is going to play in the American Hockey League this year, and if they're struggling or if they're like borderline for the playoffs, and he's playing lights out in the American Hockey League, they may try to push that. The one situation with the Flyers, and Russ and Eck and I have talked about this, and I think we agree to disagree, has been Wayne Simmons, because Van Riemsdyk essentially takes Wayne Simmons' spot on their power play and on the left side, and he's an unrestricted free agent, and there's been talk of not a lot of progress when it comes to Wayne Simmons. And if they're sort of borderline playoffs, sort of like Toronto was a couple years ago, you've got a UFA who's extremely valuable. Do you hold on to that guy and then probably lose him for nothing other than cap space and free agency, or do you move him and get more assets back? And that's going to be an interesting dilemma for Ron Hextall as the deadline approaches.
Yeah, and I think every situation is different, but I always err on the side of competing now. So I would tend to think you take him as far as you can. And then you have to make that decision. But a lot depends on whether you need anything and whether you can achieve that with trading him as well. Or, if you decide there's something else, maybe you can get something for him now if you want to make that. So I think you got to look at all your options in that case. But I think it's I've heard fans say, oh, it's just a bad spot to be in. Well, no, actually, it's a good spot to be in. You've got options with Simmons, and you'll get something for him if you want to trade him now. You'll get something for him. You want to trade him later, or you can just utilize him because his style of play is perfect for the postseason. So if you tend to believe you can make a run, then you can just keep him and say, hey, that's just the way it is. It's the price of doing business.
Okay, guys, great show. We will be back tomorrow with another edition of the Hockey Buzzcast. Keep our fingers crossed. For Kevin Allen, for Peter Tessier, for Russ Cohen, who is barely here. I'm Michael Agello. Thanks for watching, and remember, without the buzz, it's just hockey.